Our first speaker is Sonja Brentjes, who is president of the International Academy for the History of Science. And she's going to speak to us this morning on a holistic approach in the history of the mathematical sciences in Islamicate societies. Before Sonja starts, though, we'll have questions after. Everybody, please remember to speak up when you ask your question. So, because it's a big room. So, anyway, Sonja.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you very much to everybody who came. Thank you very much for inviting me. I was very surprised. I apologize that I transform myself now into an alien, but if not, I cannot see the screen. Beyond that, I found the question rather challenging and difficult because, how can I figure out what's the most important question is? I have many questions, and which ones are more important than the others is very difficult to say and depends on actually what I'm doing at a given moment. But then I tried somehow to figure out a little bit what might be of kind of interest. I hope at least it will be. And so I came up with something that I did not consciously think about just this morning when I walked down here, that somehow combines the three levels that I consider methodologically important when I do research, namely microhistory, macrohistory, and medium-level history. And history of science in general, but history of mathematics in particular, because this is what we are talking today about. In Islamicate societies has problems on all three levels. Still, we did not overcome a number of historiographical issues that are situated on these three levels. But because I don't have 2 hours, I'm not going to talk about them as methodological points, but I hope you understand when I show you my objects that these issues are involved. Second thing, because I think that a majority of you have little personal contact to history of mathematics in Islamicate societies, just 2 comments, right? Mathematical sciences are not what they are today. They are partially what they are today, but they are partially much broader. So mathematical sciences are the 4 Neoplatonic sciences: number theory, geometry, astronomy, and music, and then a whole bunch of so-called branch sciences. They are subordinated to the fundamental sciences. And there we find sciences that today do not belong any longer to mathematics, like optics, like astrology, occasionally, right? Astronomy, mechanics, and all that. From my perspective, however, in order to pick up one theme of Scott yesterday, to be fair to the historical actors, these are mathematical sciences, right? So our perspective, or my perspective, is a little different from possibly your perspective working on other periods and regions. In addition, there's a sort of problem that evolved in the last 10 years when colleagues pointed out to something we actually knew but never paid attention to, namely that the concept of what the mathematical sciences are in Islamicate society seems to have changed over time. And we do not understand this process, really, partially because the colleagues who work on that do not work on history of mathematics. They work on occult stuff. And that's exactly the point. The occult sciences become, for a number of scholars over, let's say, 800 years, a member of the club of the mathematical sciences. And that's a big question for me, how to deal with that. What does that really mean? There's a challenge for us. So this just as a framework, right? Now, down to earth, what is my holistic approach? The first is I brought you the only type of little, what Karen said, doodles that I ever found in a mathematical manuscript. And some colleagues think, not historians of mathematics, historians of manuscripts and art, think that is the childhood product of one of the Ottoman sultans. But I like them. They're quite cute. Now let's see how that goes. Right. I wanted to talk in two parts, so I'm going to talk a little bit faster because actually I cut out my introduction, and then I thought, no, better I give you a little introduction. The first is what I simply call, it's nothing deep, manuscripts as containers. And the second one, I go down on the textual level in a manuscript, namely textual practices. I should say perhaps the dominant historiographical practice still is we work on individual texts, right? We take them out of a manuscript. The manuscript is at best secondary, if not something much further in the background. And that's one argument I'm making. That's not very helpful if you want to understand the mathematical sciences in their social-cultural environments. We need to study also, and quite seriously, the immediate context in which they are preserved, right? And try to understand, starting with a big but simple task of cataloging. Not that there are no catalogs, I mean cataloging for us, where do mathematical texts appear in which contexts, right? So, now there are several aspects, of course, what's bound together, when, where, and why, which we need to answer. So the options are, we have a single text, Euclid's Elements, if it's complete. If it's partial, then of course it's not in the manuscript as a single text. We have several mathematical texts on one topic in manuscripts. We have several mathematical texts on different topics. We have mathematical texts together with texts from other disciplines, but we have no real feeling for which are these other disciplines, and is there any, somewhere, sometime, any regularity to it, or is it all accidental? Then we have, sorry for my cold, then we have the paratext. These are marginalia, colophones, ownership marks, flyleaves, independent brief notes on empty pages, etc. There is basically no study that I'm aware of that takes any of these things in history of mathematics as a research object. It's occasionally used because sometimes you want to know something about an ownership mark, but not as a systematic research problem. Then we have, of course, the question, who produced such collections? There are options, and I took scribe, but scribe is just a marker. Yeah? I, of course, could also ask, who is a scribe? But do we have a single scribe? That's codicology. Do we have more scribes, two or more? These are the two points that codicologists make for differentiating between manuscripts. And what does that mean? That we have either mixed manuscripts or so-called multi-text manuscripts. And we have tons of incomplete copies. And we have no debate about what that means. All right. What do I think we can learn from that? Well, my experiences, we can learn something about teaching practices of different parts of mathematics, because many of these manuscripts come from a teaching context. But we also can, of course, learn something about links between mathematical topics to philosophical questions, to religious disciplines, and surprisingly enough, we can even occasionally learn something about major debates on methodology among Muslim scholars. So now it gets difficult. Of course, in a number of cases that I've seen, we get information about the relationship to other disciplines, about the status of the mathematical sciences. Are they really sort of at the end of the chain of many disciplines, or do they move? Are they flexible, etc.? We get information about movement of specific texts. Where do they appear? Are they just staying in Baghdad, or are they popping up somewhere, let's say, in Mukran, which is Pakistan? Yeah, any city you can choose. And of course, you get information about ownership of manuscripts on an individual level and on an institutional level when you do it systematically. I wanted to show you 3 manuscripts. The first I chose randomly. I just opened the British Library and said mathematics. And so there came a compound manuscript. I took it. And to my delight, it is an important manuscript. That's British Library Additamentum 74-73. It's a collection of at least one or perhaps more predecessors. So that's another thing we learn, yeah? Not every manuscript is just a new production in an complete sense. It is a new production because it's a copy, but it doesn't have to be a new collection. It can be just a copy, right? And it has different content, it has different themes, and represents different disciplines. The second example comes from the BNF. This is not randomly, but it's nothing I've worked on, but I knew for a long time that it's an important manuscript. It contains 51 texts on geometry, which is already quite impressive, and branch disciplines. It may be a collection of the second generation, so that it's a copy from the original that the compiler produced. It's dated to the year, Christian year 969. It's high level for the period, high level mathematics. And it's something that a colleague in history of philosophy calls for philosophy 1-volume libraries. So that's an interesting institutional development in history of philosophy, that people start to collect texts and copy them and bind them in one manuscript. Right? That's a question we never raised, and so I'm quite happy to see this here as an intention of the original compiler to have a specific collection of important. I would be willing to call that for mathematics a 1-volume library, and the question would be, do we have more of this type, or is that an exceptional outlier? Right? And the last one is something I worked on. Since you can read it, maybe when I run out of time, I simply will skip that. That's an interesting text. Again, I did not look for it. I ran into it in the Bergische Staatsbibliothek. It's a manuscript that has a life cycle of at least 400 years, meaning over 400 years I can trace its movement from somewhere in Iran to Istanbul via somewhere Egypt or Syria. And that's interesting because it's a teaching collection. It's Euclid's Elements and Commentaries, and in a later period, astronomical fragments were added to it. So I see in this manuscript a very nice focal point on how the mathematical sciences were taught. And I see that because they are Turkish marginalia, not in Turkish and Arabic, but the names of the student or teacher is Turkish. I see Iranian people with their text or their marginalia. So it's a living manuscript for 400 years. That's a very rare case, at least I do not know more than this one. Now let's see, can I do that? I wanted to open this manuscript, but I can't. Well, what do we do, Adrian? Let's see whether that works. If not, I think you don't mind to see an Arabic manuscript. Yeah, that's fine. Now I get my vision problem. Right. Oh, yeah, no.
We'll do it eventually. There we go.
So that's a second folio in this manuscript, and we have 2 descriptions of this manuscript. There are 20 texts in it. One description by the catalogers of the British Library, and another description by a young colleague who just in 24 published his dissertation. I start with what we learned, because then I need to go back to my PowerPoint. We learned that this is a single scribe manuscript, so one hand wrote this entire manuscript. A couple of texts are dated to the year 639 Hijra. That's 1241, so it's relatively early. There's at least one text copied in this manuscript that says that the scribe copied it in the North African city of Mahdia in the year from a manuscript that was copied there in the year 541. That's 1139. Why is that interesting? Because the text that has this colophon is, in a double sense, very interesting. It's usually sold in the literature as a text by Apollonius on the conics, and a text on the conics in a city in North Africa in the 12th century is, given what we know about movements of text, etc., at least for me, quite interesting. But then when you look at the text, what turns out, it's not a text on the conics per se, it's a mixed text that nobody studied so far, from an extract of Apollonius' conics and an extract of burning mirrors by Diocles. Because I run into this problem at least once in the last month in a completely different context. I find that very remarkable, because usually what we encounter in manuscripts is a text by one author and not a text by two authors on different themes. So there are two options. It's either incomplete text, they are just copied one after the other, or we have, like in this other case that I know, a mixture by some scribe, by some other author, who mixed two texts together and produced a new text, right? And that's an interesting phenomenon on the level of the textual practices, yeah, which I think we do not really understand. Now, can we go back? I will not do that with the other manuscript.
Sure.
Thank you very much. So what is the British Library saying on that? It's a collection of 20 treatises plus shorter notes and excerpts related to mathematics, philosophy, history, and related objects, including a number of Greco-Arabic texts. The manuscript was copied in Zul Qa'da 639, May 1242, at least in part from an exemplar that was copied in the west side of the city of Mahdia on the 11th of Rabi'a, 531, December 1136. So that's the British Library. It's not completely correct, see, but here is a young colleague with his dissertation in Munich on one of the very interesting texts in this manuscript, namely the planetary hypothesis of Ptolemy. Yeah, that's another, of course, very interesting element in this collection, if it's still copied in North Africa. So what does he write? The manuscript contains works from a wide range of fields, mostly mathematics and astronomy, but also philosophy. A considerable part of the manuscript has a direct connection to Thabit ibn Qurra. Besides some of his own mathematical works, the manuscript contains Thabit's translation of Nicomachos' Introduction to Arithmetic, the only copy that we have, in parentheses, next to a fragment of Apollonius' Conics. Parts of the Arabic version of it are also ascribed to Thabit. In addition, the philosophical works in the treatises by Al-Kindi, as well as two treatises on psychology, namely those by Bakr al-Mawsi and by Avicenna. This is worth mentioning insofar as a combination of mathematical with philosophical and especially psychological issues in the planetary hypothesis is mirrored by the contents of this collection. That's a very strong statement in both cases, and in both cases it's wrong. The manuscript does not focus on Thabit. There's a single text by Thabit on the calculation of the crescent after new moon, and the presence of philosophical and mathematical texts in the manuscript does not reflect the content of the hypothesis. It's accidental that there is a connection. That's my position, right? And I find it highly problematic that Paul suggests implicitly that the core content of the manuscript is Ptolemy. So let's look what indeed is in there. It's one person. So we have the option whether it's a professional scribe or a scholarly scribe, meaning whether he copied it for himself or whether he made it to earn money. Okay? There is no systematicity in the arrangement of the text. I wrote it down, but in order to save time, I'm not reading it. They are, in German you would say, kunterbunter durcheinander. So it starts with philosophy, then comes something on aphorism, then comes something on astrology. Kindi is not philosophy, but astrological history, etc. So it's not a systematic manuscript, right? And if we want to understand this manuscript, we really have to go into the details now on the microhistory of this manuscript, and we find a copy, a text, which has a colophon that says it was copied for the library of a minor ruler in Al-Andalus, namely Al-Mu'tamid in Seville. And that is dated, I mean, the man is dated, so it's a century older than the copies in Mahdia. So what we have here is the option that this manuscript came into being, the collection of the text came into being in 3 phases, starting somewhere in Al-Andalus with one part of the collection, getting another part in Al-Mahdiya, and getting perhaps another part in a different town that's not mentioned, because the other colophons have only a date but no place. Yeah, so I cannot make a statement. Now when we look for what the content is, yes, what do we see? We see 2 opposite movements of the text. Yeah? We see a majority movement from the east to the west, mainly from Baghdad, and we see a minority movement from the west, from Al-Andalus, at least to Mahdiya, which is east of Al-Andalus, but maybe even further, because we also have little fragments in there that come from Egypt. Yeah, so then I stopped with this manuscript because I have no time really to do research about it, but for me it shows looking in a manuscript and trying to understand its own history does something to understand better certain elements in history of mathematics and gives additional information. Right? So let me go to the next one. And we will not check that. I have a little picture later on. Here you have it. Yeah, so at least you have an impression. Again, we have basically one hand, maybe with some changes in little notes, but the main 51 texts were written by one person. This person is a mathematician in the 10th century, pretty famous, well known in the sense, As-Sijzi. So you can read about him. It's published, parts of this oeuvre is published in French. Yeah. But it's possible, and I don't want to go into the arguments here, that the actual manuscript is a later copy. Yeah. We have all the colophons and the dates for the 10th century. We have no later date. So that's another problem with manuscripts. We can never be sure when the manuscript was compiled and when the writers really did it, even if we have a date. Yeah? I have seen enough colophons where only the old date is copied and not the recent date of actually production place. Yeah? What's interesting too in this manuscript, as I said, it's very famous. Many colleagues have worked on it. Nobody has written something about the entire manuscript. That Sijzi says he took a number of his texts from a colleague, namely Nazif ibn Yum, who is a physician and a mathematician in our understanding, and who lived partially in the same cities where Sijzi lived, namely Shiraz and Baghdad. And so it's quite possible, I at least think this is what the colophon suggests, that the two were acquainted, met with each other, that Sijzi could visit the library of the colleague. And so we have this cooperation issue of yesterday, and we have no term for cooperation whatsoever. Yeah, not even helping guy or something like that. It's just they do, but they don't name it. But I find that important to understand what we also do not know, networks among scholars, right? And this we get to specific informations here in addition to what we get from the colophons and the sequence, sequence of the manuscripts. On the left, now let's see whether I can do that. Is that? Yeah, here. You see, I hope, that this is a different paper than this one. Yeah? By the way, they are all paper. Okay? These are maybe 20 folios. They all have this little white triangular paper down here. So somebody sat down to read the text, found that they had lost parts, went and got himself another copy and other paper, glued the paper in, and then you see here this writing. That's one of the arguments why that may be a later copy, and finished the lines. Yeah? So he restored this manuscript. So it's a nice, interesting little issue. How do people work with manuscripts that are incomplete? Yeah? How do they correct text? Do they rewrite the entire text, or do they work within the text? Yeah? These are all little things about practices. The other thing on the other side here is here between two texts on balances, we get an information that also refers to the network issue, namely that this text comes from a collection that actually was attributed to scholars of the 9th century, famous people, the Banu Musa, and that this copy was in the hand of a famous person of the 10th century, Abdurrahman as-Sufi. These are things I never get from anywhere. No history. There are lots of histories, chronicles, etc. I do not get this information. If we want to have this information, we need to go and work through the manuscripts. If we want to know something about people exchanging manuscripts, talking to each other, working possibly with each other, having tea and chatting. So that was the second example. Now the third, where are we? I have half an hour left. Oh, that's great. So quickly on this one, this, as I said, is a teaching manuscript. It contains Euclid's elements in the edition of Nasir ad-Din at-Tusi. That's middle of the 13th century Iran. I think the collection starts somewhere in the early 14th century. Why? Because there are people in the environment, in the direct and in the secondary environment of Tusi, whose comments or problems or new little texts are part of this manuscript. So let's assume it's early 14th century Iran, Mongol period. It's a very flourishing period in mathematics, so it's very nice to have such a document because, and I didn't bring the document, I didn't bring the link, it's full of marginalia. So we can study what happens in early 14th century Iran when they teach the elements. What happens is they add commentaries. So there are a number of commentaries from people of the 9th and 10th century attached to it. And I can see that probably the students didn't care for the comments because there were few marginalia. They really focused on the basic fundamental text, right? But then I already said we get, in a later part, in the second half of the manuscript, we get other texts that have nothing to do with the elements, and they come from different centuries, and they are basically focusing on astronomy and astrology. And I think this comes when the manuscript arrived in Egypt. Because in the Egyptian context, in the Mamluk period, what we have is a development of a new mathematical subdiscipline. It's a discipline of timekeeping, where basic problems of Muslim religious ritual are dealt with astronomical and mathematical tools, and a new kind of professional group emerges. And we know now that this also moves into the official school teaching. this discipline, but it's not in Iran. Yeah? It somewhere has I don't know, a mountain range between in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, because it arrives in Mecca. There's enough testimony that this new discipline and the texts, etc., are taught in Mecca and Medina, but there's nothing further to the east. And that's one of the big questions, why did that happen? All right, so, and at the end, I know the copyist is early 18th century in Istanbul, so we have it in the Ottoman period. Right? Now let me see what that. So there are lots of interesting features, of course, as with every manuscript. Only 3 parts, but I made already. We have a living manuscript of 400 years, which is relatively rare. My very unsophisticated, because not based on research, impression is most manuscripts end their life at some point and are not further worked with, in the sense that new texts are added. This one is a living manuscript because time after time a new text is added. Right? The other thing I said already, sometimes when we are lucky, we get some information about methodology debates. We seem to have that here. And so I took some of the little things out. I just need to see the next one. Right. What we have here, that's the Euclidean text. What we have here is that the students read 5 other editions of the Elements parallel to this edition. And of course you may ask, and I did ask myself, why would they do that? Why is it not enough to study the mathematics with a very nice edition by Nasser Dinatusia? Why do they need to read 5 other copies? And these are copies over 400 years. Copies is a wrong word. It's an edition that is ascribed in the middle. Let me see. Yeah. It's ascribed to the first translator at the beginning of the 9th century. I don't say it is, yeah, but it is ascribed. It is ascribed to, let me see, someone we didn't know that he wrote an edition, that he compiled an edition of Euclid's Elements. It's a scholar of the early 14th century, famous in astronomy, Nisaburi. Here is someone of his contemporaries, another very famous Iranian astronomer, Qutbuddin Shirazi. Here we have another person of the 9th century, belonging to the second group of the translators, editors of the Euclidean Elements, Thabit Bakura. Yeah, so there are all sorts of things. Oh, Abhari. This is a person who has relationship to Iran, but he lives in Iraq. He moves back and forth. He writes on philosophy. He's a typical madrasa teacher of the period, quite famous for his commentary on the Almagest. And of course, we have copies of his edition of the Euclidean Elements. So why did they read all these things and copy content? So my explanation is because by this period, this method of tahqiq, of verification, that starts in philosophy with Ibn Sina, possibly going back to Aristotle. I'm not so informed about that part of the history. And then gets a real boost by a religious scholar called Fakhreddin Arazi in eastern Iran, Afghanistan, modern geography, who says, you know, these ad hominem attacks in a scholarly debate are really annoying. And we should not do that any longer, because that was the basic method in legal dialectics. Yeah? You sort of reject a thesis of your opponent by saying bad things about the guy. That has something to do with a method for verification of religious statements where the morality and the social reputation of the person who transmitted these religious statements was a central point to evaluate the veracity of the content. Right? So Fakhreddin Arazi says, let's stop that. That's the wrong way of doing it. And he can do that because it's no longer about the statements of the prophet as before. So what does he say? We need to read the text of the person. We need to make sure that we understand that this is an authentic text. that this is a reliable text, that this is not a falsification of the author. Yeah? And so we need to collect all sorts of manuscripts and make a comparison of the philology. And this is what I think is going on here on the first level, that they do a comparison of the very different ways in which the Euclidean elements philologically are presented. And that's one feature of transmitting the Euclidean elements, quite a difference to the Almagest. Everybody wants to write a revision of the elements, not so much because of the mathematics. It's the language that changes. And my interpretation of this phenomenon, because we have really quite a large number in my view, is because this lends authorship. Yeah, it's no longer primarily the elements of Euclid, but it's the elements of Abhari of Euclid. Yeah? So it's a cultural phenomenon that we encounter here, combined with this methodological debate, which is very, very strong. And it's dominating a lot of philosophical and theoretical debates in the religious sciences, and I think it spills over, and I know from a colleague that it also spills over into medicine. So that's the first level, the philology. The second level of the methodology is you have to understand the content, right? Which is new, yeah? In comparison to the previous method. You have now to understand the content. How do you do that, says Farhadi Narazi? Well, you study the problem. You go and read books and see what is said about it. Once you have understood the particular thesis of your author, you can start writing commentaries about it. But if you are a real good scholar, that's not enough. You now go and contextualize the thesis of the author by reading other books and trying to understand in which context does this thesis arise and what you have to say about it. And have you done that? Then you are a good scholar. All right, they don't do that. I don't see a trace of this higher level method here, but at least I'm already amazed that I have this kind of evidence, which seems to say, not surprisingly, because Nasir ad-Din Atusi is one of the famous muhaqqiqs, one of the famous representatives of this method, right? To see that in mathematics, and it would be worthwhile, of course, to explore whether that's an outlier or whether it happens more often. Good, so much for the container issue. The textual practices. The textual practices. So there's no, we are now on a lower level, yeah, we are now on text in the containers. There is no historical analysis of the organizing principles as their changes over time and space of mathematical texts. Nor is there, of course, a study of relationships of how mathematical texts are organized in relationship to other disciplines, whether they are different or whether they proceed in the same type of textual construction methods. Yeah? And this means there is no history of the book in history of the mathematical sciences in Islamicate societies. What do I understand under sort of organizing a text? There are different phases. So the first part is what I wrote down here. What about titles? Do they always have titles? And what kind of titles do they have? Do they change? What are the titles saying, right? What's the relationship between a title and a text? Do they have authorship marks? And how does that relate to understandings of authorship? Is that changing over time? Is that regionally specific? What do they have tables of content? How do they orient the reader? Yeah? Let's say I don't want to read the entire text. I have a specific problem. How do I get to this problem? Yeah? How do I know where to go in the manuscript? If I only have 5 pages, okay, I read the 5 pages. Yeah, but if I have 200, then I may not want to read 200 pages. I want to go to the problem directly. Do they have forms of pagination or foliation? Do they have rubrication, which is marking things in red to pull your attention to something? what is about the layout? Do they have a layout? Does it change? And in which sense does it change? Has it something to do with the content of the text, or has it to do something with cultural developments? Is it social group specific, the layouting? Is it specific when you do it for yourself, when you do it in school, when the student does it, or when you do it for the market? Where do they place diagrams or tables? And how do they use the margins and empty pages? And I was told by colleagues who work on other manuscript cultures, why do they have empty pages? I never wondered about it because it's usual. They have empty pages, right? Do they bind the empty pages at the beginning because they have a purpose? Or does it somebody later because he just has too much paper? Probably not, because paper is always in the reputation of being scarce. So why do we have so many empty pages in mathematical and other manuscripts? It's not a feature of mathematics, right? So you may think that's rather nitpicking, but on some levels, this tells you something about writing and reading skills. And I will show you something on that. As I said, these are only my experiences over the period of working with manuscripts, so it's nothing systematic, what I tell you. I found it very surprising that we have basically no titles in the first centuries. There are always exceptions to everything I say, right? But generally speaking, we only have generic titles like something, a book of Kindi, or a summary of Khwarizmi. So the algebra is not called algebra originally. It has no title whatsoever. The first copy we have is from the 12th or 13th century, I've forgotten, and it's called summary, which usually would say it's not the complete text of Khwarizmi, but we don't know, right? So here you have a few examples of that. Up here, exactly this type of very generic title. It's the fifth book of the book of Apollonius on the conics. And then comes something we would have in printed culture somewhere below. It's not part of the title, but here it's in red, as you can see, and it tells you who translated the thing and who worked on the thing. Yeah, so that's quite usual. Here you have only, it's a book by Ibn Haytham. Finished. Yeah? And here it's in Persian, it's the same thing. It's a word about the dealing with the latitudes of the moon. So this is not the title for me. Yeah, so it's very descriptive in a sense. But this is changing over time because we get then, again, something surprising. We get rhyming titles. They get more and more flowery. They may have something a little bit to do with the major topic like arithmetic, but more important is that they rhyme. Yeah, it's the first thing I know who rhymes is, surprisingly, Al-Biruni, a leading scholar of the mathematical sciences. And it's an interesting teaching book, and it runs Kitab Atafim li Awail At-Tanjim. Yeah, Tafim. So you need to find words that make sense and that relate to each other. And they get longer and longer, these titles, over time. And the mathematicians all do the same thing. Yeah? So it's a cultural phenomenon, of course. There are very few content-specific titles. One I put down here on the Roman Steliad. And the text is indeed on the Roman Steliad, but it's not very often. You have it, but it's not a majority practice. And you also have phenomena that the same text can have different titles. So titles are apparently sort of up to the grab. Table of contents, same thing. They are not there from the beginning. Exceptions. As a majority phenomenon, no. They come up in later times. The first I find is 11th century in a text. In a manuscript, it's a collection manuscript, then you get tables of contents at the latest in the 12th century. In the text, they may be from the original author. They may be also from the copyists, because usually we don't have originals. In the manuscript, they are clearly not from an author of a text, but they are possibly from a librarian or from a personal owner to organize the manuscript. And foliation and pagination they don't have until the 19th century. So here you have two examples of a mathematical text with tables of content. Here, it's not a table, but it's an organization. It tells you which chapters and subchapters it has. The other form is here. It's marked here that this is now a table of content that's following, and it's a running text. So these are different forms that you have. In the manuscript, they are either on the cover folio or at the end. Another element of textual practice is illustration and illumination. Are they illustrated? Yes, of course, Euclid's elements, the images, if you want to consider diagrams as illustrations, which I'm prepared to do, but are they also illuminated? Now that's very clearly a cultural phenomenon. Very clean and colored copies usually are produced for the elites. That's easy to figure out because they often say so at the cover, for which library the manuscript is copied. And so we get the status information immediately by the quality of the manuscript. We know by virtue of these kinds of manuscripts that the mathematical sciences were, until the 19th century, moving around in the courtly circles. Whether anybody read them is a different issue. Yeah? But they were of a status that they had to be in a library. That's an important historiographical point because usually you have this decline thesis, and after 1100 or so there's no science. Well, in the sense of collecting these texts from the 9th century onwards, this is an unbroken cultural tradition until the 19th century. Then you have lots of sloppily copied texts, which are a nightmare, and they usually come from a school context. They are written by students. And in between, you have all sorts of variations. So now what's the impact on the reading and writing practices? I wanted to show you this. I don't. You trust me that I describe it correctly. This is a manuscript dedicated to a sultan, written for a sultan. It's one of the famous, important scientific texts of Biruni. It's his astronomical handbook. It's one of the sort of highest ranking in the evaluation of historians of science astronomical handbook ever written in Islamicate societies. And here we have a copy 100 years after it's being written in Razna in Afghanistan from Baghdad, so telling us it moved 4,000 kilometers in 100 years. That's not bad. But from the layout and the type of calligraphy, etc., it's really for a scholarly user. So what does it tell you? It comes out of the courtly library in what's way ever. I know in later cases it's stolen. It doesn't have to be. It can be copied. Maybe the palatial library was open to usage. I know that from Baghdad, that people could enter, could get the permission to enter elite libraries. So it can be totally legal that this manuscript ends up in Baghdad and being copied in a style characteristic for scholarly production. This is a different thing, which is very clearly also in a courtly context. It's the only manuscript of the mathematical sciences that I know of with a frontispiece, a double frontispiece. It's clear that this is, it is in a tradition of double frontispieces that are typical for the 10th, 11th, 12th century. This is early 12th century. In medicine, in religion, not Muslim, but Christian. And I'm trying to think in texts about animals. And the background from art history, so art historians tell us what the background is. The background is Byzantine frontispieces, right? And frontispieces in Syriac Christian literature, frontispieces in Coptic Christian literature, frontispieces in Melkite Christian literature. So we have this coming all together and getting an important cultural form in scientific manuscripts for 3-4 centuries. And I'm very happy to have that. It's a text on constellations. Now this becomes standard. The frontispieces disappear. To mark statues, you get this. Yeah? And I showed this manuscript years ago to colleagues from Islamic studies and asked them, tell me what manuscript we have. And they did exactly what I expected them to say. They said, that's the Quran. And then, no. That's Ibn Sina, the handbook on medicine. Right? And on the right, that's, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, see, I shouldn't touch the technology. There it is. This is a mathematical text. That's an edition of Nasir ad-Din Tusi of the burning mirrors of, is it? No, I've forgotten the text, by Autolycos. So it's one of the Greek texts that Tusi edits in the 13th century. Yeah? And that becomes very, very widespread. There are quite many scientific manuscripts, including mathematical manuscripts, that are illuminated with expensive colors. This here is gold, right? So we have no survey. We do not know when, where, for whom, which text in the mathematical sciences get this kind of illustration. But I know it's going on until the 17th century. I've seen that in libraries. You see, there are lots of little nice questions. So now you get a scholarly manuscript. You see the difference, right? I don't know the context here. It has no colophon, but the marginal copies tend to say to me, it should be teaching context. The next one is definitely teaching context because I know what the text is. It's about introduction to Ptolemaic astronomy. And you see what these students do. They fill the pages in between the lines wherever they find a space, right? And the copyists, and that's interesting and characteristic too for Islamicate manuscript culture, they copy everything. So we have a unique resource, yeah, for studying the teaching of mathematics and what teachers did, what students did. If we would just sit down and read this boring marginalia, yeah, we could reconstruct teaching history over centuries. But nobody does it because they are usually, again, as I say in German, Krähenfüße, crow food. Yeah? They are difficult to read often. But I like them. But here you have the addition, what the students do, flyleaves. Sometimes they are bored, they do other stuff that they are supposed by the text where they add the flyleaf to. But very often the flyleaves are also additional comments on the text the teacher talks about. This is a new development, and then I will almost stop, kick out the other textual practices. This is again for a court. We know the addressee is Iskandar Sultan, Timurid, early 15th century. In the center is first book of Euclid's Elements, confirming what we know basically, but again didn't study very systematically. The sons of the elite dynasties get some basic education in mathematics. But why I show that it is because of the margin. Yeah, you see a very different margin than from the teaching context. The margins now have to be filled in different ways, either to be nice and pleasing to the eye, or I show you in a second another way of filling the margin. In the middle, that's very micro-historical. We have exactly 2 copies in this form. Of Qutb Shirazi, this guy of the early 14th century, on one of his high-level planetary theory texts on models that replace Ptolemaic models. That's really one center of scholarly debate for several centuries in Islamic context. And you see that it has a model, so an astronomical diagram, which is usual for this kind of manuscript. You also see a lady, yeah? And I don't know how many of you would recognize which lady this is, so I tell you it's Andromeda. So this comes from the Book of Constellations of the 10th century of Abdurrahman as-Sufi, which is a bestseller in illustrated scientific manuscripts. And in the middle of the first half of the 17th century, probably Isfahan, some people of the elite thought, okay, I want to have a high-level scientific text in my library, but please, beautiful. Yeah? And so they combine it with another astronomical tradition. The art historians, in addition, say the painting is in the style of the most famous court painter of the period. It's not the court painter himself, but some student or relative or so. So that's a highly interesting feature. And when you go and check then you see, yes, indeed, some of the astronomical texts, like an astrolabe in London, has this kind of figures. You see constellations moving out into pure artwork. Yeah, so there are all sorts of interesting side effects going on with the sciences when you look at them, not just from the content. So never misunderstand me. I say, of course, we need to look for the content of text, but I need to finish. Then let me finish. Yeah, let me show you the. This is what you get. The other way of filling margins, you get now double text. And that's what I mean with reading and writing skills. You cannot read these texts. This is even 3 levels. Here are 3 different texts on this page. You can no longer read a manuscript or a text from page 1 to page 100. You can only read in parts and parcels, and you need to move. Either you move yourself or you move the manuscript. Yeah? Because it starts here and goes down here. And here it starts. It's the same thing. It starts here, then it starts here, and you have this one. So you have at least 2 to 3 different levels of reading and writing. And if you think this is not happening in the mathematical sciences, it is. This is a mathematical text. And of course, the person writes from up here down here. And so you have to move the manuscript and you have to read it in an oblique angle. Why? Don't ask me. This is another way of producing containers on one single page, again for a court recipient. And that's the last, the only text of the elements that has art in it. It's one of the typical arts, calligraphic art. And at the beginning I thought, okay, fine, he was a little bit bored by the teacher. No, the art is mathematical. These are mathematical commentaries on the elements in all sorts of ways. In the center is, of course, a prophet, right? So thank you very much.